Hey there, sleepless rabble. Let me take over for a while. Tonight we're heading into a place where the fog smells like coal dust, where hunger walks on two legs, and where being born was your first mistake. East London. Victorian era. It's not the kind of London you'll find on postcards, unless you enjoy the aesthetic of open sewers, child labour, and buildings held together by mould and prayer. They called it the East End, but it wasn't an end. It was a trap. A rough hood where survival came with a price tag, and softness was a liability. If you're here for a soft bedtime fairy tale, sorry love, wrong borough. But if the idea of grim history told with a side of sarcasm helps lull you to sleep, give this a like, subscribe for more grim tinted tales, and support Napmax on Ko-F to keep the gaslights burning. And in the comments, tell me, what would have broken you first? The stench, the noise, or the neighbours? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Boring History for Sleep, Rough Hood, Surviving Victorian East London, Filth, Fog, and the Fight to Stay Human. Let's begin. It greases you like a wet woolen blanket thrown over your face. The smog. Thick, heavy, and slightly sulphuric, as if someone tried to set a fireplace inside a coffin. It seeps into your lungs, your clothes, your soul. Welcome to East London. Sometime in the late 1800s, where the air itself feels vaguely criminal. Cobblestones glisten under layers of soot and last night's vomit. Horse dung mixes with ash, forming a slippery paste that children learn to avoid by instinct. Somewhere nearby, a chimney belches out more of the same. Coal smoke, acrid and endless. London fog, number. That's just branding. This is pollution, and it's winning. It's early morning, if you can call it that. The sun has technically risen, but it hasn't managed to push its way through the grey. Men shuffle off to dock work, or try to. If they're lucky, they'll get picked by the foreman. If not, it's another day of empty hands and hollow stomachs. Women bend over wash basins or head toward the markets with eyes low and mouths tight. Children, thin, fast, unsupervised, dart between legs and barrows, dodging fists and cartwheels alike. Some sell matches, some steal them. Most just try not to be noticed. And above it all, the buildings loom. Crooked tenements, stitched together from rot and desperation. Some lean so far forward they look like they might whisper secrets to the street. Others sag like they've given up entirely. Windows are broken, bricked, or black with soot. Curtains, if any, are made of old sacks or wishful thinking. You're in Whitechapel, or Spitalfields, or Bethnal Green. It doesn't really matter. The postcode might change, but the soundtrack remains. Coughing, shouting, clattering hooves, and that strange silence when everyone is simply too tired to speak. In the distance, a church bell tolls, late, cracked, and entirely ignored. No one here has time for God this morning. There are mouths to feed, debts to dodge, and fingers to keep attached. Welcome to the smog, sweetheart. Don't hold your breath. You won't make it 5 minutes. There's no such thing as privacy here. Not in East London, not in 1872. The streets are narrow, the buildings close, the walls thin. And if you're not being watched by the neighbour 3 doors down, you're being watched by the rats, or the debt collector, or the parish officer with the teeth like gravestones. The alleys curve like intestines, full of dark corners and darker intentions. Every brick seems to carry a memory, a fight, a whispered deal, a secret birth, or worse, a forgotten one. Cobblestones remember what people try to forget. In this part of the city, the street is your living room, your workplace, your escape route, your grave. You eat there, sleep there, sell things or yourself there. You bleed there, and if you're lucky, you make it back inside before you do. Look to your right. A costermonger shouting about bruised apples no one wants. Left, a toothless woman screaming at a child that may or may not be hers. Above you, a boy dangles from a second-story window, spitting on pigeons. Below you, a puddle that might be water, but probably isn't. Every face tells a story. Most of them tragic, some of them dangerous, and all of them watching. Children learn young to observe, to assess who's drunk, who's sick, who's alone long enough to steal from. They don't call it survival instinct. It's just life. Eyes are everywhere, and blinking is a luxury. And then there's the watchers you don't see. The slum landlords in fine coats. The moral reformers with their notebooks and furrowed brows. The occasional journalist, slumming it for a story to horrify the readers in Kensington. They scribble while the kids starve. But the most dangerous watchers? Your own neighbours. Because in a place where everything is scarce, food, money, affection, gossip is currency. And secrets? Worth more than bread. So if you're thinking of hiding something here, don't. The walls have ears, but the streets have eyes. And they never, ever blink. Imagine fitting 16 people into one room. No, not for a party. For life. In the East End, that's not exaggeration. That's Tuesday. The Victorian tenement is a feat of architectural malice. Crammed between factories and slaughterhouses, these buildings were thrown up faster than you could say, cholera outbreak. 3 to 5 stories high, wood rotting, bricks already slouching, and staircases that creak like they were begging for death. Inside? A single room per family, or per group of strangers pretending to be one. One bed, if you're lucky. A mattress on the floor, if you're luckier. The rest, sleep standing, sitting, or curled into corners like forgotten laundry. The walls are thin enough to hear your neighbours cough, cry, or collapse. Privacy is a myth. So is ventilation. The air is thick with breath, steam, smoke, and whatever's rotting in the shared chamber pot. Speaking of which, no toilets. Not private ones anyway. A single outdoor privy shared by the whole building. And by privy, we mean a hole, a seat, and an odour so permanent it deserves its own tenancy agreement. Water. If there's a pump nearby, great. If not, that's a walk. And every bucket is precious. You'll use the same one for washing clothes, bodies, dishes, and babies, though not always in that order. And the rent? Astronomical. Slumlords charge by the square inch and don't care what grows on the walls, unless it stops you from paying. Miss a payment and you're out. Which means the next desperate soul is in. No shortage of those. The tenement isn't a home, it's a waiting room for something worse. The street, the workhouse, or the grave. But while you're still breathing, you do what you can. Hang rags for curtains, boil cabbage until the stench becomes comfort, and pretend you're not listening when the woman next door gives birth at midnight, with nothing but a towel and a prayer. This is tenement life. Cramped, cruel, and constant. But hey, it's got a roof. Most nights, he doesn't knock, he bangs. Fist to door, boot to floorboards. The kind of knock that isn't a question, it's a countdown. The rent collector comes on Mondays, or whenever he feels like it. His schedule is as unpredictable as his temper. What is predictable? He wants payment. Full, in coins, no excuses, no delays, and definitely no barter. A dead husband, a sick child, or a bad week at the docks. Not his problem. The tenement owners, respectable gentlemen in respectable neighbourhoods, never show their faces here. Instead, they hire enforcers with loud voices and heavier fists, and so the collector arrives. Pocket watch ticking, ledgers under one arm, a cane in the other, not decorative. Rents are high. Absurdly so. But the logic is simple. The poorer the tenant, the fewer options they have. Slum landlords knew they could charge outrageous sums for rooms that would offend a Victorian pig. And since moving was impossible and protesting suicidal, people paid, or tried to. When the money isn't ready, things get tense. Furniture is the first to go, if there is any. Then clothes, shoes, pots. The collector doesn't care if it's your only blanket or your child's boots. It has value. You don't. If you've truly got nothing, the next knock will be from the bailiff. Eviction. Often violent. No warning, no mercy. And once you're out, your room is already being rented to someone else by nightfall. Someone with just enough pennies and just as few rights. Sometimes neighbours gather to help. Pass around a few coppers. Argue for time. Sometimes. More often, they watch silently. Afraid to draw attention. Because when it's your turn to fall behind, no one wants to be next in line. The collector never apologises. Why would he? To him, this is just business. A building full of rent. Never mind the humans inside. And as his footsteps fade down the hallway, the tenement exhales. For now. Until next week. Or tomorrow. Or this afternoon. Because the rent doesn't care if you've eaten, only if you've paid. You'll hear it before you see it. A rhythmic pounding, like a monstrous heartbeat, echoing through the smog. That's the factory calling. And if you work there, you better answer. The Victorian factory wasn't just a place of labour. It was a machine that swallowed humans whole and spat them out older, sicker, and slightly less intact. Brick by brick, these industrial behemoths rose over East London like temples of soot, promising wages and delivering weariness. Step inside, and the first thing you notice is the noise. Deafening, relentless, mechanical. Gears grind, belts whip, hammers slam. Speaking is pointless, listening is dangerous. You learn to read lips or lose fingers. Then there's the air, thick with dust, fibres, fumes. Ventilation, optional. Windows, painted shut with grime. After 10 minutes, your lungs itch. After 10 years, you're coughing blood and calling it just a chill. Most shifts run 12 to 14 hours. Longer if the overseer's in a mood. Breaks are short. Wages are laughable. Safety measures, that is the joke. Machines are rarely guarded. Accidents frequent. Compensation non-existent. Lose a hand. Gain a limp. Die of exhaustion. There's always someone to replace you. Children work here too. Of course they do. Their hands are small, perfect for cleaning inside dangerous moving parts. When they get crushed, it's not policy, it's statistics. Women too fill the factory floors, for half the pay, double the scrutiny. They're strong, precise, and expected to be invisible. Pregnant? That's inconvenient. Breastfeeding? Find a corner. Or don't. What are they making, you ask? Cotton cloth, matches, nails, rope, bricks, the materials of empire, the spoils of trade, the fruits of colonialism, packaged neatly for upper-class consumption. Produced in East London, consumed everywhere else. Outside, the factory bell rings again. Another shift over. Another begins. Men, women, children flow in and out like blood in a wound that never quite heals. In the belly of the beast, There are no promotions, no pensions, no protection, just motion. And if you stop moving, you're already gone. They're fast, they're cheap, and they don't complain much. That's why Victorian industry loved children. In East London, childhood wasn't a phase, it was a liability. If you were small, you worked. Period. Factories, matchstick plants, rope walks, brickyards, all needed hands nimble enough to untangle threads, climb into machines, or haul loads twice their size. Children obliged, not because they wanted to, but because starvation was rarely optional. Some started as young as 5. Officially illegal? Yes. Enforced? Not really. The laws existed mostly to make politicians feel good, not to protect the kids. In textile mills, little girls cleaned around spinning machinery while it was running. The tiniest mistake, torn scalp, broken fingers, or worse, boys in chimney-sweeping gangs scaled soot-choked flues barefoot. If they got stuck, which they often did, someone lit a small fire below to encourage movement. Some came out alive, some didn't. Brickyards were worse. Children carried wet clay, stomped mud, stacked heavy blocks. Cold in the morning, blistering by midday, and no shoes, ever. Cuts and burns were standard. So was collapse. Then there were the matchstick factories, notorious for phossy jaw, a condition where exposure to white phosphorus rotted the jawbone from the inside out. Imagine your face crumbling while you try to stay employed. And yet, parents sent their children in willingly because they had to. Because a penny earned by a child might mean a crust of bread for the family. Guilt was a luxury few could afford. Some reformers tried to intervene, the famous Child Labour Acts and inspections. But East London had a way of hiding its young. The factories knew when inspectors were coming. Children would vanish, reappear, shrink into the shadows. Besides, the children were good workers. They learned early that silence and speed were rewarded. That weakness was punished. That being tired meant being replaceable. So they worked, and grew up too fast, or not at all. If East London had a patron saint, it would be gin. Cheap, sharp, and always there when life got unbearable, which was often. Victorian gin wasn't glamour in a glass, it was escape in a bottle, and escape was badly needed. A few pennies could buy enough liquid courage to forget the hunger, the noise, the damp. For an hour, maybe 2, you could float above the filth, until you crashed. Gin shops, often just rooms with a counter and a jug, dotted every street like abscesses. Licensed, unlicensed, nobody really cared. They sold gin by the dram, sometimes mixed with turpentine or sulfuric acid to stretch it further. The result? Blindness, madness, and sometimes death, but all for a fair price. It wasn't just men drowning in gin, women drank too, heavily. Mother's ruin, they called it, not just because of what it did to mothers, but what it did to the children left behind. Babies fed gin to stop their crying. Toddlers found asleep beside unconscious parents. Entire families lost to a haze of drink and desperation. Why gin? Because water wasn't safe. Tea was expensive. Beer was filling. Gin was efficient. Fast-acting. Oblivion in liquid form. Moralists railed against it, of course. Tracts were printed. Sermons delivered. But none of them came with rent money or childcare. The temperance movement, wrapped in lace and superiority, didn't reach far into Whitechapel. Some drank to forget. Some drank to survive. And some drank because it was the only thing that ever felt warm. Of course, Drinking came with its own risks, arrests, beatings, injury, death. But sobriety wasn't exactly a picnic either. So the bottle passed from hand to hand, and East London drank itself numb. Not because it was weak, but because it was exhausted. Because sometimes the only way to endure hell is to blur the edges. Forget recycling bins and eco-conscious choices. Victorian East London had its own version of sustainability, born not from virtue, but from pure necessity. Enter the rag and bone men, the scavengers, the unofficial sanitation workers of the rough hood. By daylight or dusk, they combed the alleys, gutters and piles of refuse in search of anything remotely valuable. Rags, bones, metal scraps, broken bottles, everything had a buyer if you knew where to look. And in East London, everyone was looking. Rags were gold. Not literal gold, but close enough. Sold by the sack to paper mills, they'd be pulped down and reborn as low-grade newsprint or cheap packaging. You'd be surprised how many sermons and shipping labels started life as someone's underpants. Bones? Not creepy, just practical. Boiled down for glue, buttons and bone char, used in sugar refining. Yes, really. That sweet tea the middle class enjoyed, filtered through the skeletons of the poor. And metals, old nails, tin bits, bent spoons were snatched up, sold to tinkers, and turned into something vaguely useful again. Maybe a pot lid, maybe a weapon. Children took part too, of course. Whole gangs of them running through the muck barefoot, yelping whenever they found something shiny. Sometimes they were paid, sometimes they weren't, but they learned fast. If you spotted a copper pipe, you didn't shout, you ran. It was dirty, degrading, dangerous work. You risked infection, injury, and the occasional rat ambush. But it kept food on the table, or at least crumbs on a floorboard. The truly desperate went deeper, into dust heaps, slaughterhouse bins, river mud, searching for something, anything to turn into coin. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fair, but in a city that threw away people as easily as paper, some folks made a living by salvaging both. Because in East London, even garbage had more value than the poor. It's a quiet night in Whitechapel. Too quiet. That's usually a bad sign. Somewhere near the edge of the cemetery wall, two figures move in silence. One carries a shovel, the other carries motivation. They're not here to mourn, they're here to dig. Fast. Before the constable comes back around. They're body snatchers. Or if you want to sound respectable, resurrection men. In Victorian East London, death was never the end. Not if your corpse was worth more than your life. Medical schools needed bodies to dissect. The law limited which corpses could be used, usually criminals or unclaimed paupers, but the demand was enthusiastic. And where demand outpaces legality, capitalism gets creative. Resurrection men made a living stealing freshly buried corpses. The fresher, the better. They sold them to anatomy schools for a tidy profit. No questions asked. Sometimes they even took orders in advance. A young male corpse, strong build, no decomposition, premium rate, child cadavers, even higher. Pregnant woman, jackpot. The trick was speed. A burial at dusk meant a body on the professor's table by dawn. Graves were shallow in pauper cemeteries, easier for both the budget and the thieves. Coffins, if present, were flimsy. Cloth bindings easier to slip through. They rarely took clothing. That was theft. But a naked corpse? Technically not illegal. At least not until the Anatomy Act of 1832 tried to rein them in. Of course, the law didn't stop everyone, especially not in East London. A few more coins could mean a full stomach, rent, or, let's be honest, gin. Families knew the risk. Some weighted coffins with stones. Others sat vigil all night. Poorer families just hoped no one noticed. Or cared. The medical profession turned a blind eye. They needed the practice. And dead men don't file complaints. It's grotesque, morbid, efficient. Because in a city obsessed with class, even death wasn't democratic. It started with good intentions and very little chalk. In the alleys of East London, where children grew up faster than milk soured, someone had the bold idea to teach them how to read. Not for poetry or politics, but for signs, for warnings, for the words, no loitering, no work today, or keep out, fever inside. The ragged schools weren't palaces of learning. They were patched together classrooms in old warehouses, stables, or churches that smelled of mould and old biscuits. No desks, no uniforms, no windows you could actually see through. Just benches, blackboards, and the impossible optimism of the volunteers who ran them. And yet, they came. The children. Barefoot, soot-faced, smelling like the river. They came for shelter, for a biscuit, for something that didn't involve picking pockets or sorting bones. Some even stayed long enough to learn their letters. Lessons were basic. Reading, writing, sometimes a little arithmetic. Enough to calculate your wages or realize you'd been cheated. Morality was part of the curriculum too. God, obedience, cleanliness, often in that order. Because the ragged schools weren't just about education. They were about reform, about civilizing the poor, about scrubbing the East End one child at a time. The teachers were a mixed bunch. Some were missionaries with stern voices and endless patience. Others were retired tradesmen, widows, idealists. Some had once been students themselves. The best ones understood that you had to teach hungry kids differently. You had to let them nap if they were tired, feed them if they were pale, forgive them if they swore, and never ever ask what their parents did at night. Success was measured in small things. A boy reading his first street sign, a girl signing her name for the first time, a child choosing the classroom over the alley, even if just for an hour. Of course, not everyone approved. Some said it made the poor too bold. That education gave them ideas. That teaching them to read was like handing a knife to a monkey. But still, the doors stayed open. Because even in the dirtiest corners of London, hope could sit cross-legged on a floorboard and spell its name out loud. You could smell it before you saw it. A wet, meaty sweetness hanging in the air, mingled with fish guts, rotting cabbage, and the unmistakable tang of something that used to be an animal. Once. The East End markets were less food paradise, more survival roulette. They were everywhere. Whitechapel Road, Bethnal Green, Spitalfields, makeshift stalls, rickety barrows, crates stacked on mud-slicked cobbles, sellers with voices like rasping bells, shouting over each other, hawking goods that could generously be described as edible. Here, food didn't have to be fresh. It just had to be available. A bruised apple for a halfpenny. A haunch of meat so grey, you wondered if it had already walked itself to market. Fish with staring eyes and open mouths, buzzing with life, the maggot kind. No refrigeration, no health inspections, and if someone claimed it was pork, you just believed them. Or didn't ask. Offal was common. Liver, tripe, kidneys, the bits the West End wouldn't touch. Boiled, fried, sometimes even raw. There were jellied eels, if you had teeth, and boiled sheep's heads, if you didn't. Everything had a price, usually too high. Bread was cheap, but often mixed with chalk or alum to bulk it up. Milk was thinned with water, sometimes sewer water, depending on the dealer's ethics. Tea leaves were reused, dried, and sold again. And again, and again. The poor didn't shop. They negotiated. They bartered, begged, scavenged. Women fought over the last cabbage like it was gold. Children scraped scraps from the mud. Men turned pockets inside out for a bruised onion. You didn't eat to be full. You ate to not faint. And still, there was life here. Colour. Laughter, sometimes. A shared joke over a too sour plum. A seller calling you love as she handed you a bag of questionable turnips. A brief flash of human warmth among the offcuts and the flies. Because even when food was scarce and safety a myth, the market gave something else. The illusion of choice. And for one coin, one breath, one bite, that was enough. You'd hear them before you saw them. Taters a penny a scoop. Lovely ripe pears, not a bad one in the bunch. Last of the plums, cheaper than dirt. Costermongers were the East End's street poets. Loud, fast-talking, elbows deep in fruit crates and insults. They didn't just sell produce, they performed it. Selling apples wasn't just business, it was theatre, survival, and personality, all crammed onto a wooden cart with wobbly wheels. Most costers worked with handcarts or barrows, pushing their wares through puddled alleys and crowded markets, calling out in Cockney slang that twisted vowels into musical notes. Their voices were hoarse from shouting, their fingers stained from handling overripe fruit, and their backs permanently bent from the weight of wheels and work. The goods, whatever they could get cheap, apples, onions, potatoes, rotten on one side, sellable on the other. They knew how to angle a turnip so it looked less bruised. They could stack cabbages into pyramids of false hope. Some even carved faces into root vegetables to make the kids laugh. A tiny rebellion against despair. But don't be fooled by the banter. Costermongers had a code. Honour among traders. You didn't steal another's pitch. You didn't undercut your mate. And you never, ever sold someone else's goods without asking. Break the rules, and you'd find yourself face down in the gutter with a bruised melon where the sun doesn't shine. Police saw them as nuisances. Reformers called them loud, dirty, immoral. But the truth was, costers fed the East End when no one else would. No credit checks, no judgment. Just a potato, a price, and a wink. Women were in the game too. Strong, sharp-tongued, and twice as quick. Costermonger girls could carry a basket on one arm and silence a heckler with the other. There was pride in it. In the rhythm. In the work. In the hustle. Because in a city that tried to crush you into silence, costermongers were loud. And in East London, loud was sometimes all you had left. They moved in groups. Always. Not because they liked each other, but because a pack of boys could do things a single child couldn't. You'd see them darting through Petticoat Lane, weaving between barrows, eyes sharp, feet quicker, half-starved, half-smiling, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Street gangs in East London weren't the leather jacket, flick knife kind. Not yet. They were dirtier, smaller, and often barefoot. Their weapons were speed, distraction, and a very well-practiced sense of timing. They picked pockets, lifted bread, stole handkerchiefs, and pawned them for pennies. Sometimes they worked in markets, helping costermongers shout their wares in exchange for bruised apples or the promise of a crust at the end of the day. Other times they acted as lookouts for older criminals. Eyes on corners, signals and coughs and whistles. The older ones taught the younger ones how to snatch without being seen, how to melt into crowds, how to talk to police without saying a word of use. You learned fast or got caught. And getting caught meant a beating. Or worse, a visit to the house. That's what they called the prison. Or the reformatory. Or whatever grim, grey place children disappeared into once they'd been officially branded as criminals. Because Victorian law didn't care if you were 9, if you stole, you paid. And the system made sure you'd never forget it. But for some, the gang was better than home. Better than the tenement. Better than listening to your mother cough herself through the night. Or waiting for your father to come back drunk and dangerous. On the street, at least, you had agency. A purpose. A rank. Even if it was just the kid who distracts the butcher. Not all gangs were cruel. Some looked after their own. Shared food. Watched out for the coppers. Even protected girls from worse fates. They had rules. Unwritten, but enforced. To outsiders, they were pests. Vermin. To each other, they were brothers. Tattered brothers in a war no one admitted was happening. In polite circles, they called them unfortunates. In the East End, they were just women, trying not to starve. Prostitution wasn't a profession. It was a last resort. And in East London, last resorts were more common than clean drinking water. Women sold themselves for pennies, enough for bread, enough for a night indoors, enough to keep a child alive one more day. Some stood on corners, others leaned in pub doorways, some walked the alleys until their legs gave out, and some didn't walk back at all. There were no velvet parlours here, no lace and powder. This was street trade, rough, fast, and often violent. The clients were dockers, labourers, drunkards, sometimes even policemen. There was no such thing as safety, and rarely anything resembling choice. Respectable society looked on with horror, not at the poverty, but at the scandal. Women were expected to be pure, silent, invisible, unless they failed. Then they were condemned, punished, erased. The same men who paid for their bodies spat on them in daylight. The same churchgoers who preached virtue looked away when they found a girl's body in a ditch. There were brothels too. Grim houses run by madams with sharp elbows and sharper ledgers. Girls came in young, left early, if they left at all. Some were barely teenagers. Some had been sold by their own families. And the law? Inconsistent at best. Occasionally the police cracked down, usually to appease the press or make an example. The rest of the time, they turned blind eyes or took their cut. The worst danger didn't always come from the work itself. It came from the silence that surrounded it. The refusal to see these women as human. As daughters, mothers, sisters. As victims of circumstance, not criminals of morality. Because in the East End, being female was already a risk. Being poor and female, that was a sentence. And working the streets was survival dressed as sin. Some stories are whispered even here, in the roughest, loutesten Victorian Londons. Because even the streets of Whitechapel have ghosts they'd rather forget. This one starts quietly. A woman, alone, frightened, unmarried, poor, her belly swollen, her prospects shriveled. She's already been fired. Her family won't take her back. The parish offers a place in the workhouse, but only if she gives up the child. Then someone whispers, "There's a woman in Mile End. She takes in babies, just a small fee, just until you're back on your feet." Baby farming, they called it. A name that sounded almost gentle, like growing something, like care. In truth, it was the commodification of desperation. Women, often older, widowed, or just as poor, took in illegitimate or unwanted children for money. Sometimes a weekly payment. Sometimes a lump sum to take the child off your hands entirely. No questions asked. The problem? The payments often stopped. Or were never meant to continue at all. And babies are expensive. They cry. They need food. They get sick. They attract attention. So the less scrupulous farmers, and there were many, found ways to reduce costs. Diluted milk, neglected feedings, overdose of laudanum to keep the child quiet or still. And when death came, a shrug, a burial in a cheap pine box, often under a false name, if there was a burial at all. Some women had multiple infants die in their care, dozens, and still they continued. Because the system didn't ask questions, because the poor didn't have voices, because people wanted not to know. In one infamous case, Amelia Dyer, the so-called ogress of reading, was suspected of murdering hundreds over the decades. She was finally caught in 1896, but she was far from alone. And let's not pretend all baby farmers were monsters. Some tried. Some loved. Some just failed in the face of poverty too deep to climb out of. But the line between neglect and murder blurred easily in the dark corners of the East End. This was a city that punished women for being poor, then punished them again for trying to survive. And the smallest, most innocent victims, they didn't even get names. Just graves, if that. Because in East London, a baby was only as safe as its mother's options, and most had none. It started with a cough, not a dramatic one, just a dry, tired rasp in the night air of a Whitechapel tenement. Buried under the other sounds, a crying baby, a creaking bed frame, a rat chewing something important. But the cough didn't go away. It got deeper, wetter, redder, and then came the fever. Disease was a constant in East London, as familiar as hunger, as expected as rain. It crept through the narrow alleys and climbed the crumbling stairwells. It pooled in the standing water beneath the privies and rose with the steam from overcrowded basements. It didn't discriminate, but it had a preference for the poor. Cholera was the fast one, violent, sudden, and unreasonably efficient. One day you had a bit of diarrhea, the next your neighbours were carrying your body down the stairs in a borrowed sheet. It struck without warning, spread through contaminated water, and loved places where 20 people shared one outdoor tap. So, naturally, it loved the East End. Then there was tuberculosis, or consumption as the Victorians called it, almost poetically. It didn't roar like cholera, it whispered. A slow wasting, a long goodbye, pale faces, bloody handkerchiefs, hollow chests and haunted eyes. Everyone had known someone who had it. Most had buried someone because of it. Typhus swept through like a bad mood, sudden, deadly, and impossible to contain. Lice spread it, and everyone had lice. You could burn your clothes, boil your sheets, pray a little harder, but it didn't matter. There was smallpox too, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and countless unnamed things that bloated bellies, blistered skin, or simply made you vanish before your 5th birthday. Infant mortality wasn't a tragedy, it was statistics. In some East End districts, over half the children died before they ever saw adulthood. Most before they saw shoes, hospitals. The good ones were for the paying classes. The poor went to charitable infirmaries, overcrowded, underfunded, and full of prayers that rarely worked. Doctors did their best with what little they had, but they were fighting fog with candlelight. Sanitation reformers tried to help, men like Edwin Chadwick and Dr. John Snow, and slowly, things did improve. A bit. Clean water, sewer systems, slum clearances, but progress was slow, and bureaucracy slower. Because for the poor, disease wasn't a crisis. It was routine. You didn't ask if it would come. You asked when Dot and hoped. When it did, it chose someone else. They came dressed in black, clutching Bibles and good intentions. The missionaries, the well-meaning, the God-fearing, sent from the cleaner parts of London to the East End with one goal: to save souls, not to feed them, not to house them, but to save them. They stepped into the alleys of Whitechapel like tourists in a nightmare, staring at the dirt, the faces, the gin shops, as if they'd stumbled into a foreign country where the natives spoke only desperation. And they preached. Oh, how they preached. In street corners, in soup kitchens, in converted stables, now called missions. They warned of sin, of damnation, of the moral decay rotting through the city like fog through a broken window. They handed out pamphlets, tracts, the occasional stale bun, all with strings attached. You want help? Come to prayer first. You want bread? Sit through the sermon. You want shelter? Let us cleanse your soul while you freeze. To be fair, not all of them were heartless. Some genuinely cared. Some gave without condition. Some stayed, got their hands dirty, learned the names of the children, but many, far too many, came with judgment disguised as charity. They taught the women to cover themselves, though they owned nothing but rags. They told men to stop drinking, though there was nothing else to numb the pain. They scolded children for swearing, though they'd never been taught any other words. They meant well. That was the cruel part. Because meaning well doesn't fill a stomach. It doesn't warm a room. And it doesn't make poverty holy. Meanwhile, the churches stood tall just streets away, great stone cathedrals echoing with hymns, while the people outside coughed blood into their sleeves. Salvation was a concept too abstract to matter. You couldn't eat it. You couldn't sleep under it. And it didn't stop your landlord from knocking at dawn. So the East End listened, nodded, sang when required, and went back to surviving. Because in this part of London, God may have visited, but he didn't stay long. They looked almost respectable. Almost. On Sunday mornings, the East End changed costume. The rags were washed, or at least beaten free of the worst stains. The holes were hidden under carefully arranged folds. The shoes were polished, even if they still had more holes than soles. Hair was brushed, buttons reattached with mismatched thread, faces scrubbed raw. Because Sunday was performance day, not just for God, but for the neighbours, and for yourself. People paraded down the streets in their Sunday best, the one good outfit each family owned, passed down from child to child, patched until the original cloth was a rumour. Girls in faded dresses walked beside boys in jackets, 2 sizes too big. Mothers wore pride like perfume, even if their stomachs growled. Fathers held themselves straighter, as if dignity could be stitched into a frayed collar. The church was full, partly out of faith, partly because it was warm. Sometimes it was the only heated room they'd step into all week. The hymns gave structure to the chaos. The sermons gave rhythm to the silence. Afterwards, some families walked to Victoria Park, if they had the strength. A moment of grass, of space, of not having to watch your back. Children ran like their feet had forgotten the weight of poverty. Adults sat quietly, soaking in the illusion of rest. But Monday came fast, and with it the return to factory boots, soiled aprons, and threadbare underthings. The best clothes were folded away, stored like treasure, protected from the week's grime, if possible. The contrast was sharp. Sunday dignity, Monday desperation. The Victorians loved this display. The idea that even the poor cared about appearance, order, respectability. It proved, they thought, that poverty wasn't moral failure, just unfortunate circumstance. A solvable one, a manageable one. But the truth was simpler. The clothes didn't make the poverty disappear. They just made it quieter. Because in East London, shame was stitched as carefully as any seam. And survival meant learning how to look better than you felt, even when your stomach was empty and your soul was fraying. It was help, technically. Parish relief, they called it. A lifeline, in theory. Offered to the deserving poor, a phrase as slippery as the tenement stairs. But in East London, everyone knew the truth. Once you asked for help, you gave something up. Usually your dignity. The Poor Law of 1834 had changed everything. No more handouts without scrutiny. No more simple aid. Now, the goal wasn't to relieve poverty, it was to discourage it, make it unpleasant, make it shameful, make the workhouse the only real option. But if you were desperate enough, you could still try for outdoor relief, help that didn't require full institutionalization. A bit of money, a loaf of bread, coal for heating maybe, always with paperwork, always with inspections, always with consequences. The parish officer didn't knock politely. He arrived like a magistrate. He'd ask questions, many of them, about your wages, your habits, your children's whereabouts, your marriage, your laundry, your morals. He'd look at your furniture. He might count your spoons. If he found anything excessive, a clock, a second blanket, a pair of shoes not currently worn, you could be denied. Or worse, marked as unworthy. The system was designed not to help, but to discourage, to filter, to push you toward the workhouse, where conditions were deliberately harsher than the lowest paid job. That was the logic. No one should choose idleness over employment, even if no employment existed. And if you were a woman, God help you. Single mothers were eyed with suspicion. Widows were tolerated. Unmarried with child, condemned. Men were expected to work, no matter their health. Children were often counted as economic assets. Some lied. Some begged. Some disappeared from the books entirely, choosing to suffer quietly rather than subject themselves to the system. Because relief wasn't relief at all. It was transaction, exposure, control. And once you entered the books of the parish, it followed you, like a stain. So the East End learned to avoid asking, to rely on neighbours, to stretch a penny, to lie when the knock came at the door. Because in Victorian London, needing help made you suspicious. Accepting it made you marked. They passed each other every day. The lady in the horse-drawn brougham, gloved, perfumed, face half hidden beneath a hat worth more than a labourer's yearly wage. And the girl on the curb, holding a bruised pear, watching the carriage wheels cut through the gutter muck like it wasn't there. They belonged to the same city, but not the same world. Victorian London thrived on contrast, nowhere more than in the East End. One street might house costermongers, thieves, washerwomen, and widows. The next, a gentleman with a conscience and a taste for exotic cigars. There were silk curtains beside broken panes, charity banners beside gin dens, and in between, the watchers. Those who didn't quite fit either side. The scoundrels weren't always who you thought. Some wore waistcoats, some gave speeches, some profited from rent, from sweat, from silence. Landlords who never saw the rooms they owned. Employers who docked wages for being 3 minutes late. Doctors who charged for advice they never gave. And the ladies? Not all were cruel. Some did more than gossip and donate old lace. Some taught in ragged schools, ran soup kitchens, paid for burials, gave bread without question. But even they kept gloves on, metaphorically or not. Between the extremes was a blurry space, full of survivors. A bootmaker who once stole to feed his brother. A seamstress who took in 2 children that weren't hers. A barmaid who knew every secret in Spitalfields and never repeated a word. Not saints, not criminals, just people, navigating a system that left no room for grey. The East End wasn't full of villains. It wasn't full of victims either. It was full of nuance, of choices made in hunger, of kindness wrapped in rough cloth, of cruelty whispered through lace fans, because poverty didn't make people noble, and wealth didn't make them wicked. But neither one made you safe. And in a city like London, where the gutters ran alongside the parlours, you learned fast. Everyone plays a role, but some get to take off the costume. The year was 1888. The season was late summer. The place, Whitechapel. And the feeling? Fear. Thick, silent, electric. Women stopped walking alone. Men walked with suspicion. Newspapers foamed at the mouth. And in the dark alleys of East London, a shadow began to grow. Not just a man, not even a name, just him. Jack. The Ripper. But before the myth, before the penny dreadfuls and the endless conspiracy theories, there were real women. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, killed with such violence, such precision, that the murders became public spectacle. Yet these women weren't strangers to suffering. They were already part of East London's forgotten class, poor, often homeless, occasionally drunk, and always judged. In life, society ignored them. In death, it dissected them. The Ripper didn't invent violence against women. He didn't bring darkness to Whitechapel. It had always been there. But he became a lens. A sharp, bloodied lens through which the rest of London finally noticed the East End. Not with compassion, with curiosity, with horror, with fascination. Reporters swarmed. The middle class came on slum tours. People whispered theories over breakfast and locked their doors at night. In Kensington. Meanwhile, the women of Whitechapel still had to work. Still had to walk streets where the gaslight barely reached. Still had to bargain for food, for rent, for survival, knowing full well that someone out there wasn't bargaining at all. The police floundered. The press invented. The streets watched. And Jack, he became an idea. A sickness with a name. A ghost that lived in headlines and corners. An excuse to ignore the real issue. That these women weren't killed because they were unlucky. They were killed because they were vulnerable and disposable. The fear outlasted the murders. The myth grew taller than the tenements, and in the shadows of Whitechapel, the real killer was never caught. But the city learned something. Not about justice, about entertainment. Because in the end, Jack didn't just murder women. He sold papers, and London bought them. When the murders stopped, the fear didn't. Jack the Ripper vanished into myth. But Whitechapel remained, raw, damaged, and now under permanent observation. Because once the middle class had stared long enough into the East End shadows, they decided something. The place was rotten, diseased, infected with poverty, crime, and moral failure. The murders had given them an excuse. In the wake of the killings, the authorities didn't rush in to improve safety or living conditions. They didn't light more streets or house the homeless. Instead, they sent inspectors, clergymen, moralists, all to find out what kind of people let something like that happen in their own backyards. The answer, of course, was simple. Desperate people. But that didn't make for good policy. Women bore the brunt. The press dissected their pasts, their drinking habits, their loose morals, as if murder could be explained by the victim's failings. As if poverty was an invitation to violence. The word prostitute was thrown like a slur, regardless of whether it was true. Men were scrutinized too. Not as potential killers, but as failed protectors. Drunken husbands, absentee fathers, men too poor to move their families away from the slaughter sites. Even children weren't safe from the gaze. Reformers flooded the area, offering moral salvation where food might have been more useful. Ragged schools filled with fresh donations, churches overflowed, not with the faithful, but with the curious. And through it all, the people of Whitechapel endured. They kept working, coughing, hiding, surviving, now under the glare of a society that had never cared before, and still didn't really care now. The Ripper Panic didn't cleanse the East End. It stained it. Because once a place becomes synonymous with horror, people stop asking why, and start pointing fingers instead. They blame the gin. They blame the women. They blame the fog, the dark, the devil, but never the poverty, never the system, never the silence. They wore the uniform, the dark blue tunic, the tall helmet, the polished boots, but in East London, it didn't matter much. Respect wasn't stitched into fabric. The Metropolitan Police were created to bring order, structure, authority. But in places like Whitechapel, they were mostly just decoration. Men walking beat after beat through a city that had learned long ago to take care of itself. Or not at all. The Bobby on the beat was supposed to reassure the public. To deter crime with his steady pace, his notebook, and his truncheon. But he was outnumbered, underpaid, and often completely out of his depth. He couldn't arrest a landlord for neglect. He couldn't feed a starving child. He couldn't stop a woman from selling herself just to eat. But if a costermonger shouted too loud, or a boy nicked an apple, well, then the law came down swift and proud. Many officers were decent men, trying to keep order in a place that had none. Others were brutal, corrupt, or simply indifferent. A few took bribes, a few took pleasure. Most took headaches home every night and returned in the morning to more of the same. Policing the East End was like trying to sweep fog. You could make a show of it, but nothing really changed. The crimes were endless. Theft, assault, illegal lodging, vagrancy. But the causes, hunger, overcrowding, unemployment, stayed untouched. The Ripper case had exposed it all, not just murder, but the limits of law. Investigations botched, evidence lost, witnesses ignored or silenced. Some blamed incompetence, others suspected conspiracy. But the truth was simpler. The police had never been equipped to handle this place. Not in numbers, not in training, not in understanding. And the people knew it. Some pitied the constables, others mocked them. Most simply stepped around them, like another obstacle between themselves and the end of the day. Because in East London, justice didn't wear a badge. It wore tired eyes, tight fists, and the knowledge that if you wanted safety, you'd have to make it yourself. It began with curiosity, turned into charity, and ended as entertainment. By the late 19th century, had East London become more than just a rough part of town. It was a destination, a spectacle, a guided tour through misery, arranged neatly for those with silk gloves and parasols. They came in droves, ladies in carriages, gentlemen with moustaches and notebooks, missionaries with pamphlets. They'd heard stories of filth and vice, of gangs and gin, of dark alleys full of desperate women, and even more desperate men, and they wanted to see it. Slum tourism, they called it. Though no one used the term aloud. Instead, it was framed as social investigation, moral engagement, awareness raising. The tours were organised by do-gooders and journalists. Sometimes even the police. Routes were carefully chosen. Dangerous corners were avoided. Local guides, often clergymen or reformers, explained things with just enough detail to titillate, never enough to implicate. They walked past open drains, peeked into the tenement doorways, listened to children coughing in unison. They visited ragged schools, soup kitchens, even workhouses, marveled at how the poor lived, what they ate, how they smelled. Some took notes, some took souvenirs. All of them left. To the locals, it was theatre, an intrusion, a parade of strangers staring at them like animals in a cage, taking in their poverty with the same energy one might observe exotic birds at the zoo. But many played along. Some tenants cleaned up for the occasion. Children performed their best Dickensian pitifulness. Women told their worst stories. Because if misery was going to be a spectacle, they might as well try to earn something from it. The press loved it. So did Parliament. Because the more shocking the images, the easier it was to raise funds, to justify reforms, to create policies that sounded good on paper and did very little in practice. And when the carriages rolled away and the ladies clutched their pearls and wiped invisible grime from their sleeves, East London stayed the same. Because poverty didn't need visitors. It needed change. And change wasn't part of the tour. It looked like kindness. It sounded like compassion. But somewhere, under the sermons and soup, there was a stage. And the poor had starring roles. Charity was everywhere in East London. Missions, aid societies, temperance halls, rescue homes. Each with its own banner, its own rules, its own idea of who deserved help and how loudly they should say, "Thank you." The intentions? Often genuine. The outcomes? Complicated. There were soup kitchens where hungry men had to sit through hour-long prayers before receiving a bowl of thin broth. Clothing handouts that required you to prove your piety. Bread distributed in front of crowds, never discreetly, because humiliation, it seemed, made the food taste better. Photographers arrived too. Early social documentarians with tripods and flash powder, capturing the misery for pamphlets and fundraisers. Look, the captions implied, at what we're doing for these people. The people themselves had no say in it. They simply sat, stared, became exhibits. And the wealthy? They gave generously. Money, blankets, sometimes even their time for an hour or two, before retreating to drawing rooms and warm parlours, where the smell of sewage and coal smoke could be left at the doorstep. Some charities were fiercely paternalistic. They didn't just want to help, they wanted to improve, to mould, to cleanse. Recipients of aid were expected to act grateful, speak properly, attend church, stop drinking, wash frequently, even when there was no soap or water. And if they failed, the aid disappeared. The poor learned how to perform need, how to lower their eyes, how to recite the right phrases. Because in this theatre of compassion, performance was survival. Not just poverty, but respectable poverty, the kind you could print in a newsletter. Of course, not all aid came with strings. There were quiet hands, humble helpers, nameless women who gave without expectation. But those weren't the ones writing reports or seeking donations. Because in Victorian London, charity often came with an audience. And if you couldn't applaud, at least you could bow. Tea always started with a speech. Polished shoes on a polished floor. a gentleman with a fine moustache and finer intentions, clearing his throat in front of Parliament. He spoke of the condition of the labouring classes, of the necessity of sanitary improvement, of moral uplift. His words were carefully chosen, his outrage carefully measured. The newspapers called it progress. The poor called it Tuesday, because in East London, reforms rarely arrived where they were needed. Or if they did, they came so slowly, so diluted, so tangled in red tape and middle-class anxiety that they changed very little, except maybe how people talked about poverty. Sanitation acts were passed, streets swept more regularly, in theory, drainage improved if you lived near a reformer, water pumps upgraded, but only after a cholera outbreak. Tenements were inspected, but landlords found loopholes. Again and again. Slum clearance? It happened. Blocks were torn down. New housing was built, but rarely for the ones displaced. Families who'd lived 3 to a room were suddenly on the street because the rent in the new buildings was too high. Because their lives didn't fit the reformers' neat blueprints. Education acts opened schools, but children still worked 10 hours a day. Medical aid was promised, but you needed a clean shirt and 5 forms to receive it. Labour laws limited hours, unless you were a woman, or a child, or desperate. And always, there were conditions. Prove your worth. Your cleanliness, your morality. Accept surveillance as the price of help. Accept less as the price of being born poor. The biggest reform of all, the 1834 Poor Law Amendment, had claimed to solve poverty by discouraging it, by making assistance so unpleasant, so humiliating, that only the truly desperate would apply. And that goal? Achieved with brutal efficiency. The problem wasn't that people didn't care. The problem was that those in power cared in the wrong direction. They wanted to fix the poor, not the poverty. So the speeches kept coming. The laws kept shifting. The headlines praised progress. And the East End kept coughing. Because paper reforms don't warm a room, and good intentions don't scrub mould off a tenement wall. It began not with fists, but with whispers. In the back rooms of match factories, in the brake yards of the docks, in crowded tenements where air and hope were equally scarce, something stirred. Not quite anger, not yet action. Just a growing refusal to keep saying yes. The Victorian East End wasn't built for rebellion. It was built for obedience. Long hours, low pay, quiet mouths. But sometimes, even the worn down find their voice. Especially when there's nothing left to lose. Early strikes were small, risky. Sometimes just 2 or 3 workers walking out, demanding an extra penny a day or quarter hours for children who couldn't stand upright by noon. They were met with disbelief, then dismissal. Literally. Employers called it ingratitude. The press called it sedition. The police called it illegal assembly. But the workers kept coming. In shoemaking workshops, in tailoring rooms where women's backs ached from hunching over hems, in brickyards, rope factories, bakeries, the demands were rarely radical. A lunch break. Soap. Not dying on the job. The basics. Organising wasn't easy. You had no time, no space, and no rights. Trade unions were barely tolerated, and often infiltrated. Meetings were held in secret. Decisions were whispered between shifts. Lists of names were kept hidden in shoes and coat linings. If you were caught, dismissed, blacklisted, evicted, beaten, and still they came, because they had seen what happened when no one spoke up. Children with stunted spines, men with fingers missing, women coughing blood onto seams they weren't allowed to leave unfinished. Some strikes failed, most did, but not all. And with every walkout, every leaflet, every angry chant shouted into smog-choked air, something shifted, slowly, stubbornly. A sense that power didn't only live in boardrooms and chapels, that even the poorest hands could slam a door shut, even the weakest backs could refuse to bend. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. And in East London, where silence had always been the default, even a whispered no echoed louder than most would dare admit. It started with teeth, or more precisely, the lack of them. Phossy jaw, they called it, a condition caused by white phosphorus, the key ingredient in match production. The girls who packed the matches, mostly teenagers, some younger, developed abscesses in their gums, faces swollen, teeth rotting, bone dying. Their breath smelled of decay. Their employers said nothing. Until one day in 1888, the match girls at the Bryant and May factory in Bow said something for themselves. They were poor, working-class girls, Irish, Jewish, English, living in East London slums, supporting entire families on pitiful wages. They were expected to be grateful, quiet, replaceable, and for a long time, they had been. But after a reporter, Annie Besson, fierce and unafraid, published an article exposing the factory's conditions, the company panicked. It demanded the girls sign a document denying the claims. The girls refused. The company fired one of them. The others walked out. Around 1,400 women and girls, many in their teens, stood outside the gates and refused to return. No union, no legal protection, no money. Just fury and principle. The newspapers scoffed. Bryant and May threatened. The public watched. But the girls organised. They formed a strike committee. And they wrote letters. They told their stories about fines deducted unfairly, about burns on the hands, about sisters who died before 20. And suddenly, people listened. Public sympathy turned, pressure mounted, and within a few weeks the company backed down. The girls won. They secured better pay, safer conditions, no more fines for talking, no more silent suffering, and something more powerful than all that, a precedent. For the first time, poor women from the East End had fought and won. Not with violence, not with leaders in suits, but with sheer collective will. They became a symbol, not of charity, but of strength, of what happened when those expected to endure finally refused. And in the smog and noise of 19th century London, a new sound rang out, the clear, defiant voice of working women. There are places where death feels like a thief, and then there are places where it feels like a release. In the East End of Victorian London, suicide wasn't whispered as tragedy. It was muttered as inevitability, quietly, almost respectfully, as though it was the final private choice in a life where all other choices had been made for you. The newspapers didn't talk much about it, unless it was sensational, scandalous, or involved someone who wasn't poor. But it happened. Constantly. Men in their 30s who couldn't find work. Women who'd buried too many children. Girls barely old enough to bleed. Boys who had only known hunger and fists. There were many ways to go. The Thames took the most. Cold, indifferent, dark. A short walk from the worst parts of Whitechapel to the bridges. And then just silence. Others took rat poison, rope, razors. Some simply stopped eating. Some drank themselves out of their bodies and into oblivion. Inquests were short, if they were held at all. Coroners asked, was there madness? The answer was always yes, but never the kind they meant. It was the madness of too many mouths and not enough bread, of coughing all night and pretending it didn't hurt. of giving your last blanket to a child and hoping not to wake up. The church condemned it, of course, said it was sin, said it was weakness, but most who spoke those words had never seen what a Whitechapel winter did to a mother with no coal, what hopelessness did to a man after his 5th failed job interview, what grief did to a woman holding her 3rd stillborn child. There were no support systems, no therapy, no second chances, only the poorhouse, the streets, or the river. And so death became a choice, a desperate one, but a choice nonetheless, not out of cowardice, but because courage sometimes is no longer enough. And when life offers nothing but exhaustion, cold, and shame, slipping into the dark can feel like mercy. They came in boxes the size of drawers, pine, unvarnished. Sometimes no box at all, just a sheet if there was one. In the East End, death was cheap, but burials? Expensive. For families already scraping together pennies for coal, even the smallest funeral was a luxury. The coffin had to be rented or made. The burial plot, if purchased at all, was shallow, shared, or temporary. Cemeteries were full to bursting, bodies stacked in communal graves, names lost to time and paperwork. Sometimes the body waited in the tenement for days. No money for a hearse, no one to fetch a priest. Children forced to sleep beside the stillness, too used to death to be frightened by it. Just waiting for something. Undertakers did what they could, some honest, some predatory. They offered payment plans, cheap packages, respectable services that involved more curtain than care. And if you couldn't pay, you handed over what little you had, a wedding ring, a family Bible, a half-decent coat. Neighbourhoods rallied when they could. Pass the hat at pubs. Women went door to door collecting coppers for flowers, for a hymn, for something to mark the passing. Because in a world where dignity was so often denied in life, death felt like the one moment it might still be claimed. Not always. Some were carted off without notice, buried nameless, or sent to hospitals as anatomical donations, not by consent but by default. One less mouth to feed, one more cadaver for medical students to dissect. Children often went without service, infants especially. So many died, so often, that grief became something internalized, a bruise beneath the skin rather than a wail in the street. But still, there were moments. A single candle in a cracked window, a lullaby sung one last time, a small procession through the alleys, heads bowed, steps slow, even if the boots leaked and the coats didn't close, because the East End knew how to grieve. It just wasn't always allowed the tools, and yet somehow, even in poverty, even in silence, even without a stone to mark the spot, they found ways to say goodbye. The city didn't sleep. It waited. When the last factory whistle blew and the costermongers wheeled their empty barrows home, East London changed shape. The smog thickened, the temperature dropped, and the streets began to breathe differently. Slower, deeper, more dangerous. Not everyone feared the night. Some made a living from it. Night watchers, they were called. Men paid to patrol alleys, markets, graveyards, and warehouses. Equipped with little more than a lantern, a truncheon, and a whistle, often broken, they wandered streets already crawling with things no one wanted to see. They weren't quite police. They weren't quite civilians. They were somewhere in between, invisible until needed, ignored once the sun came back. Their job was to stop theft, deter drunks, and shout if something was on fire. But mostly, they just walked, watched, waited, and listened. To footsteps that didn't belong. To the soft scrape of wood against a window frame. To coughing that came from somewhere it shouldn't. Then there were the rat catchers, a profession that didn't get the credit it deserved, because without them, London would have belonged to the rats long ago. They crept through cellars, butcher shops, sewer grates, with sacks, sticks, and sometimes nothing but their hands. The best had dogs, wiry, snarling terriers who could kill a dozen rats in a minute, but many went alone, scratched, bitten, covered in fleas, paid by the corpse, not the hour. Some caught rats to kill them, others caught them to sell, as pets, as test subjects, as meat. You heard that right. The line between pest and product blurred easily in East London. If it moved and didn't bite too hard, someone would find a way to profit from it. And in the darkest corners, other creatures roamed. Thieves, desperate men, desperate children, not all of them dangerous, but all of them hungry. The night was full of secrets, of transactions that couldn't happen by daylight, of survival strategies whispered between matches struck in the wind. Because when you lived in the East End, the question wasn't why people stayed out after dark. It was why anyone thought they had the choice. You could hear it long before you understood it. The rhythm of East London speech. Clipped, fast, slurred by necessity. A dialect sharpened by cold air and harder lives. This wasn't the Queen's English. This was street tongue. A language not taught, but absorbed, like soot. Cockney, they called it. But that was just the surface. Beneath it lived layers of meaning, code, rebellion, protection. A way to say one thing and mean another. A way to speak loudly in public and still keep secrets. Take rhyming slang. On the surface, it was nonsense. Say, apples and pears for stairs, trouble and strife for wife, Barnet fair for hair. But the real trick was dropping the rhyme. I'm off up the apples. And if you didn't know, you weren't meant to. It was a linguistic handshake. A signal. I'm from here. I know. I belong. Children learned it early. Sometimes before they learned how to write their names. It was the soundtrack of the market stalls. The curse shouted from a rooftop. The whispered joke between pickpockets. It was fast, funny, cruel, brilliant. It made misery more bearable. It made danger easier to laugh at. And then there was thieves' cant, an even older, darker dialect. Less rhyme, more secrecy. Words for every kind of theft, every kind of con. Diver for pickpocket. Pigeon for a target. Twist for a job gone wrong. It wasn't just slang, it was survival. Language in the East End wasn't about eloquence, it was about knowing how to say just enough. When to be invisible, when to charm, when to threaten, when to lie, and when to stay silent. Even the tone of voice mattered. A rising inflection could be suspicion. A flat reply, defiance. A well-timed pause could save your skin. To outsiders, it sounded vulgar. To locals, it was armor. A tongue forged in soot and sarcasm. Because when your world didn't give you power, you learned to wield words like weapons, or shields, or keys to the next meal. In East London, how you spoke often meant the difference between being ignored or being noticed just long enough to disappear. They spoke in code, in rhythm, in sounds that kept them safe. But words alone couldn't heal broken bodies, fevered children, or bleeding silence. For that, the East End turned not to the police or the priests, but to the women who knew pain by name and stayed anyway. They didn't wear halos, they didn't carry books, they carried towels, herbs, needles, and secrets. In the East End, help didn't always come from churches or officials. It came from the women who moved quietly between tenement doors, the ones who were called for in the night, who showed up without fuss and left without thanks. The hidden saints, some were midwives, trained but unofficial, licensed but distrusted by the system. They delivered babies in basements and back rooms, on blood-stained blankets, under the flickering light of half a candle. They worked with instinct, experience, and whatever clean cloth they could find. They kept the mothers alive most of the time. Some were healers, herb women, wise widows, foreign matrons who'd brought remedies across oceans. They had a knowledge that didn't come from books. They brewed teas for fever, mixed poultices for wounds, whispered prayers for safety. They cured with what they had: onion skins, vinegar, salt, hope. Others were simply there. Neighbors who held hands during childbirth, women who cleaned up after a miscarriage, teenagers who sat with the dying when no one else would, mothers who buried children that weren't their own. They asked no money, or very little, maybe a scrap of bread, a promise, a bit of respect. They were trusted in ways doctors never were, because they didn't judge, they didn't question. They knew what it meant to be hungry, afraid, bleeding through shame. They'd lived it. They kept silent about things no one dared say aloud. The bruises that didn't come from stairs, the pregnancies that couldn't be named, the girls too young to understand what had happened, and too old to pretend they didn't. Sometimes they paid a price, blamed when things went wrong, accused of witchcraft, superstition, corruption. But they kept going, because no one else was coming, because someone had to hold the line between agony and survival. These women didn't make history books. They made it possible for others to live long enough to be written about. The hidden saints of East London. Not because they were pure, but because they were present. And in a world that looked away, they looked straight into the pain and stayed. They didn't wear uniforms or carry titles, but the hidden saints of East London stitched hope into the broken seams of daily life. Still, even their presence couldn't protect against everything. And sometimes, the only way out of the grime and grief was through paper and ink. And a tale too wild to be true. There was always a boy with smudged fingers and a battered cap, leaning against a lamppost, selling dreams for a penny. Dreadfuls, he'd shout. Murder, madness, monsters. And just like that, the streets of Whitechapel gave way to something else. A world of vampires and pirates, escaped lunatics and masked avengers. Penny dreadfuls, so named for their price, not their value, were the working class's ticket to elsewhere. Printed on cheap paper, folded in grimy pockets, traded in alleyways, read aloud in whispers while sharing crusts of bread. The stories were outrageous, bloody, terrifying, delicious, and nothing like the reality surrounding them, which was precisely the point. In a city where children saw corpses before they saw chalkboards, where women bled in silence and men broke their backs for coppers, fantasy wasn't an escape. It was oxygen. These stories didn't soften the world, they outdid it, made it absurd, thrilling, conquerable. Sometimes the villains were rich, sometimes the heroes were poor. Sometimes a girl with a knife and no shoes could defeat the devil himself. Literacy rates in the East End rose not through sermons or textbooks, but through curiosity, through the need to know what happened next. Boys who couldn't read their own names could recite entire paragraphs of Varney the Vampire. Girls who never saw a birthday cake knew every twist in the mysteries of London. The reformers hated them. Too violent, too immoral, too stimulating, which made them all the more loved. And for a few minutes, in the flickering gaslight, a child could be somewhere else. Not in a damp room, not in a factory, not in a coffin, but in a castle, a ship, a battle, a better story. And when the chapter ended, they folded the page, tucked it close, and walked back into Whitechapel, carrying just enough wonder to survive another day. But even stories couldn't mask every truth, especially not the kind that clung to skin, to sweat, to the broken threads of daily life, like the ones woven into the laundries, the lacework, and the lies that held entire lives together. Even the wildest stories eventually ended, and when they did, reality returned like a cold draft under a crooked door. And in that reality, clean linen was a currency, and lace was stitched from tired fingers and invisible hours. Welcome to the world of quiet labour and louder lies. They called it women's work. Delicate, domestic, unimportant, at least until someone went without it. Washing, mending, stitching, folding. The endless cycle of fabric that never thanked you, never stopped coming, and never smelled quite clean enough. In East London, laundry wasn't just a chore, it was a livelihood, or the illusion of one. Women hauled water, boiled rags, beat stains from collars with knuckles already raw from everything else. The steam from communal washhouses fogged the windows, mixed with coal smoke and the sharp sting of carbolic acid. It looked almost holy. It was anything but. Some took in washing to make ends meet, a few pennies per bundle, bed linen, shirts, and underclothes. You learned quickly not to ask where the stains came from. Just scrub, rinse, wring, repeat. Then came the lace. Fragile, intricate, beautiful. The kind that adorned upper-class gowns and church altars. You'd think it came from Paris or Milan. It didn't. It came from a damp room in Bethnal Green, where a half-blind woman with twisted fingers worked by candlelight. Lacework was paid by the inch. Pennies for hours of backbreaking stillness. Mistakes meant docked wages. Perfection was expected. Illness was ignored. The irony was cruel. The poorest hands created the richest trimmings. And yet, there was pride. Quiet, yes, but real. A woman could point to a finished piece and say, "I made that," even if her name was never attached. Even if it ended up on the cuff of someone who wouldn't dare look her in the eye. But there were lies too, whispered through starch and steam. A woman might say her husband still worked, even if he'd been gone for months. A girl might lie about her age to get more orders, and no one ever mentioned the blood on the sheets unless absolutely necessary. Because in a world that saw you as background noise, laundry was survival, lace was legacy, and lies? Lies were just another thread in the fabric of getting by. But hunger never stayed quiet for long, and when the pot was empty, the question was simple. What can we eat? And what can we pretend is food? The lace dried on the line, the lies hung in the air, but sooner or later, even dignity had to make way for dinner. And in the East End, dinner was rarely what it claimed to be. They called it stew, technically true, in the way that a puddle might technically be a bath. Dinner in East London wasn't about taste. It was about survival. Whatever could be boiled, baked, chewed, or simply tolerated was fair game. And sometimes, even that was a luxury. A typical working class meal, bread. Always bread. Stale, padded with chalk or alum to keep it cheap. Eaten with margarine made from beef fat and dye. Tea if you were lucky. Hot water with a splash of milk if you weren't. Meat? Rare. And when it did appear, it had questions attached. Scrag end of mutton, pig's feet, sheep's head, lung, tripe, liver, offal, the polite word for everything other people refuse to eat, boiled beyond taste, doused in vinegar to hide the smell. Potatoes were dependable unless they'd turned green or collapsed under their own damp weight. Onions stretched a meal, cabbage filled the plate. If there was fish, it came fried in yesterday's grease or jellied into a trembling mass. Eels, mostly, still staring. And then there were the surprises. A rat caught in the cellar, skinned and stewed with root vegetables. Not common, but not unheard of. Hunger had a way of rewriting the rules. Children were fed first, adults last. Everyone lied about being full. Some mothers soaked bread in hot water and called it pudding. Some fathers ate nothing for days so their sons could have meat on Sunday. Sometimes that meat was horse. No one asked. Even in this, there was ritual. The scraping of plates, the clink of spoons, the silence that filled the room once every crumb had been claimed. A kind of reverence. Not for the food, but for the fact that there was something to eat at all. And when there wasn't, you went to bed. Not because you were tired, because it was the only way to forget. But even on empty stomachs, the East End didn't give up. Somehow, hope kept showing up. Stubborn, ragged, and glowing just enough to see by. And in the next breath, we'll follow it. The lace dried on the line, the lies hung in the air, but sooner or later, even dignity had to make way for dinner. And in the East End, dinner was rarely what it claimed to be. They called it stew, technically true in the way that a puddle might technically be a bath. Dinner in East London wasn't about taste, it was about survival. Whatever could be boiled, baked, chewed, or simply tolerated was fair game. And sometimes even that was a luxury. A typical working class meal, bread. Always bread. Stale, padded with chalk or alum to keep it cheap. Eaten with margarine made from beef fat and dye. Tea if you were lucky. Hot water with a splash of milk if you weren't. Meat? Rare. And when it did appear, it had questions attached. Scrag end of mutton, pig's feet, sheep's head, lung, tripe, liver, offal, the polite word for everything other people refused to eat. Boiled beyond taste, doused in vinegar to hide the smell. Potatoes were dependable, unless they'd turned green or collapsed under their own damp weight. Onions stretched a meal. Cabbage filled the plate. If there was fish, it came fried in yesterday's grease or jellied into a trembling mass. Eels, mostly, still staring. And then there were the surprises. A rat caught in the cellar, skinned and stewed with root vegetables. Not common, but not unheard of. Hunger had a way of rewriting the rules. Children were fed first, adults last. Everyone lied about being full. Some mothers soaked bread in hot water and called it pudding. Some fathers ate nothing for days so their sons could have meat on Sunday. Sometimes that meat was horse. No one asked. Even in this, there was a ritual. The scraping of plates, the clink of spoons, the silence that filled the room once every crumb had been claimed. A kind of reverence, not for the food, but for the fact that there was something to eat at all. And when there wasn't, you went to bed. Not because you were tired, because it was the only way to forget. But even on empty stomachs, the East End didn't give up. Somehow, hope kept showing up. Stubborn, ragged, and glowing just enough to see by. And in the next breath, we'll follow it. Hope wasn't a grand gesture. It was survival. Served in small portions, passed from hand to hand like a half-warm cup of tea. And for some, especially the smallest, it arrived in the form of a wooden door that actually stayed open. Not for punishment, but for possibility. They didn't look like much, those buildings. Cracked brickwork, crooked signs, windows too high to see out of. But for many children in East London, they were the first place that felt different. A little quieter, a little safer, a little less like being forgotten. Children's homes, missions, orphanages, names varied, rules shifted, funding came and went. Some were grim, some were kind. Most were somewhere in between. But even the worst of them offered something the street didn't. A chance. Not always a good one, not always fair, but still, a chance. Inside there were routines. Washington dress, sit up straight, meals at set times, if modest, chores, lots of them, prayers, almost always. You had to follow the rules, but rules were a novelty to many. Something solid in a world where the only constant was hunger. The best homes had staff who noticed. Who remembered your name? Who taught you to hold a spoon properly? To tie your laces? To speak without flinching? The worst ones? They didn't teach. They punished. They used silence like a weapon and cleanliness as a moral verdict. And yet, even there, friendships grew. Children learned to look after each other. To steal extra bread and share it. To sneak into the laundry for a moment of warmth. To whisper stories under thin blankets and make each other laugh. Some of these homes were the result of reformers with vision. Others, of guilt-ridden philanthropists trying to buy salvation. A few were born from love. Most were born from necessity. But they planted something. A sense that maybe life wasn't only the street. That maybe you could learn to read, hold a pen, have a trade. That maybe, if you were careful and clever and lucky, you wouldn't end up back where you started. And even when they left, too early, too fragile, too wary of the world, many carried something with them. A sense of rhythm, a scrap of stability, the memory of a bed that was theirs for more than one night. It wasn't rescue, but it was something. And sometimes, that something made all the difference. Not that the newspapers cared much about these small victories. They were too busy chasing bigger stories or shaping them. And in what comes next, we'll take a look at what the papers told, and what they carefully chose to leave out. It's easy to talk about survival when you've never had to live it. Easier still to write about it, especially when you sit in a warm room, holding a clean pen, with no idea how cold the East End wind really is. And so the press came and told stories, but rarely the right ones. The newspapers loved East London, not the people, the drama. They sent reporters into the slums with wide eyes and narrow pens. What they saw, they filtered. What they didn't see, they invented. The result was part journalism, part fiction, and entirely designed for readers who would never set foot in Whitechapel unless their carriage broke down. If a crime occurred, especially something with blood, something you could name with one word and a shiver, like Ripper, it was front page. If a child died quietly in a freezing room, it wasn't news. Unless the child had blue eyes and an unmarried mother, then it was moral outrage. The poor were painted in extremes, as threats or as spectacles. Drunken, violent, dirty, or pitiful, poetic, tragically doomed. Either way, they remained other. A world to be studied, not changed. Photographs of ragged children sold papers. So did drawings of gin-soaked alleyways and fallen women clutching shawls in the fog. The headlines screamed decay. The editorials oozed superiority. Occasionally, they called for reform, usually just after tea, when the East End organised, resisted, or fought back. Silence or suspicion, when it begged for help. Bureaucracy, when it wept. Indifference. And yet, people kept speaking, quietly, to each other, through songs, graffiti, whispered jokes in the market, through pamphlets printed on cheap ink and folded into coat pockets, through stories told under blankets while the rain tapped Morse code on broken panes. The truth of the East End didn't live in the newspapers. It lived in the pauses between footfalls on wet stone, in the breath before the next knock on the door, in the hands that kept working, even when no one noticed. And long after the press moved on to fresher tragedies, Whitechapel remembered. Because ink fades, but memory knows how to survive the fog. And in our final step, we return to that fog, and what remains inside it. What the East End carried forward, and what it could never quite leave behind. The headlines faded. The carriages rolled away. The reformers found new causes, but East London remained. Not untouched, not unchanged, just still there. The slums have names now. Boroughs, stations, overpriced flats with exposed brickwork and ironic wallpaper. Spitalfields is trendy. Shoreditch is loud. Whitechapel is a museum of itself. But if you walk slowly, early enough, when the bins are still full and the cafes haven't opened, you can still feel it. The weight under the pavement. The breath of 1,000 forgotten lives curling up through the cracks. The East End never vanished. It just got covered in scaffolding. The bones of it remain, in the curve of a street that never made sense, in the brickwork patched too many times, in the silence between trains on the overground. And maybe, if you stop long enough, you'll remember them. The girl scrubbing blood from someone else's sheets, the boy dodging a constable with a stolen apple in his sleeve, the mother boiling old bones for broth and calling it stew, the father folding his hands instead of his fists, the neighbour who gave half a loaf when she had nothing, the midwife who never asked questions, the match girl who said no. They're not ghosts, not really, just echoes. The kind that live in footsteps and walls and names carved into worn gravestones with a coin. Not everyone made it out. Most didn't, but some did. And they carried forward more than just scars. They carried fire, even if it was only a spark. Because in East London, toughness wasn't a choice. It was a birthright. And being soft didn't mean being weak. It meant surviving and remembering. So if you ever find yourself wandering through a patch of fog, where your breath catches and the air smells faintly of coal smoke and stubbornness, don't be afraid. You've just stepped into a rough hood, and it remembers you too. And there you are, still here, still breathing. You've just walked the soot-stained streets of Victorian East London and lived to tell the tale. Tough place, wasn't it? No filters, no silver linings, just raw brick, cold fog, and people too stubborn to give up. If you're still awake, well done. And if you're already asleep, lucky you. Before you drift too far though, if this story stayed with you even just a little, consider supporting Napmax over on Ko-fi.com. No lace, no guilt tripping. Just a quiet thank you in the form of caffeine or future content fuel. And if you like this episode, you know the drill. Hit subscribe, drop a like, or leave a comment telling me what your Victorian job would have been. Match girl, night watchman, or professional rat wrangler. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to Rough Hood. Surviving Victorian East London. Filth, fog, and the fight to stay human. Sleep tight, stay rebellious, and never trust a stew that doesn't look you in the eye.